Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi Prosnit and Temple Betham, for co-sponsoring this event. My name is Sharon Erickson. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto. Welcome to this educational presentation of the pros and cons of the measures that will appear on your ballot for the November 3rd election. The League of Women Voters was formed in 1920 after women received the right to vote. So this year we're celebrating both our 100th anniversary and that of the passage of the 19th Amendment. The League does not support political parties or candidates for office, but does work to empower voters. Our organization has two distinct roles. One is advocacy for public policy issues that we've studied and support. The other is voter service, bringing voters impartial information on candidates and issues, and that's the hat we're wearing today, namely to educate citizens on the issues before you cast your vote. Our speakers have studied the text of the ballot measures, reviewed content about them in newspapers, websites, and on other sources, as well as had discussion among League members throughout the state. They are prepared to give you the facts about the measures and opinions of supporters and opponents without prejudice. Let me tell you how we'll proceed. First, our speakers will provide you with some useful information and an overview of the presentation. Then each ballot measure will be discussed, its background, what it would do if passed, and arguments on both sides in favor of or against the measure. If you have questions, please utilize the Q&A function and type in your question. The chat function isn't activated. After each measure is discussed, I'll ask the presenter to answer as many questions as time permits before the next measure is discussed. If all goes as anticipated, plan on about an hour to review the 12 state and 3 local ballot measures. So let's get started. Our speakers today are Heidi Schwenk. There's Heidi. And David Springer. Heidi, you want to begin?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Sharon. Good afternoon. As you can, my name is Heidi. First off, on Election Day, November 3rd, voting centers will open at 7 a.m. and close promptly at 8 p.m. Ballots were mailed October 5th. They may take 5 to 7 days to receive. There are many ballot drop boxes in Palo Alto. They can be found at the Palo Alto City Hall, outside the city's clerk's office, Palo Alto High School, Rinconada Branch Library, and the Mitchell Park Library. Others can be found on website at sccgov.org or in your county voter information guide. There will be 24-hour official ballot drop boxes from October 5th until November 3rd. The ballots will be collected from the drop boxes by the registrar of voters starting October 7th through the 16th on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, then collected daily from October 19th to November 3rd until 8 p.m. If you have any questions about voting, one of the fastest ways to get answers is by using the sccgov.org website or by calling the Santa Clara County Registrar's office. Be sure to sign your ballot and use the postage paid envelope if you're going to mail it in. Safe in-person voting is optional at any of the many voting centers starting October 31st to November 3rd. If you would like voting assistance, contact a voting center on the Registrar of Voters as soon as possible. If you choose to mail your ballot on November 3rd, check when your post office closes. Most close at 5 p.m. Registration. The last day is with the registrar's office is October 19th, but you can still register and vote at any vote center from October 31st until November 3rd. Conditionally means that your ID information will need to be verified before your ballot is counted if you register and vote on the same day. Tracking your ballot is something new. You can register online at Where's My Ballot to track it online. You can signify if you want information to be texted to you or emailed, and you will receive an email confirmation that you have signed up. Next slide, please. The overview, as Sharon commented, we will cover each of the 12 statewide propositions and 3 local measures. We have organized them into categories to hopefully make it easier to understand the nuances of similar sounding propositions. Please take a look at the League of Women Voters paloalto.org website and your California Official Voter Information Guide for more in-depth information about the propositions and your County Voter Information Guide for measures, in-depth information. Voting rules for all state proposition to win is a 50% plus 1 major majority count. The voting rules for the 3 measures to win is 2/3 majority count. Next slide, please. This slide shows the way it is now. In 1996, Prop 209 was voted in to prohibit affirmative action when making decisions about who to hire from a particular category for public contracts, government employment, as well as who will be admitted to California public universities and community colleges for higher education. What will the proposition do? It will repeal Prop 209 and allow diversity as a factor so long as the institution is consistent with federal and state laws related to equal protection. This is not a preference initiative, it is a diversity initiative. It is to encourage the hiring and acceptance of people from different categories, such as sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. This is not a quota system. There is no obligation to use affirmative action. Government jobs, contracts, or education are encouraged to choose the best person or contractor for the best price. This prop would not force anyone to use it. The fiscal impacts, if it is passes, will have no direct effect on the California state or local budgets because the measure does not require any change to current policies or programs. All costs would depend on choices made by the state, each county, and every city's programs. Next slide, please. Supporters say affirmative action will help women and people of color who have faced inequalities as a result of who they are. The California State Constitutional Amendment will give them equal opportunities and the quality education that they deserve. Minorities are not sharing in our state's prosperity, even though they are one of the largest populations in the state. Opponents say the California state, its counties, cities, and public universities and colleges should treat everyone equally when deciding who gets into college, who gets a government job or a government contract. A yes vote means that you approve of the change this proposition would make. A no vote means that you want to keep things as they are now. This is a California constitutional amendment. Are there any questions?
You know, Heidi, we don't have any questions on Prop 16 at this point. The rabbi did ask us to mention that Prop 16 has been endorsed by the Religious Action Center, the social justice arm of the Reform Movement, and Temple Beth.
Excellent, thank you for that information.
All right.
Next slide, please.
Okay, Proposition 17. So this one is also endorsed by the Reform Movement, but again, the league is not taking sides in this session. Specifically, this is about voting for rights for people on parole. So currently within today, if you're in state prison or you're on parole, you may not vote and you may not run for office. However, if you're in county jail or on probation, there are no restrictions. California is one of 3 states that currently prevent individuals on parole from voting. So what this proposition will do is allow individuals who are on parole to vote and run for office. This does have an additional cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars, both as a one-time and an annual cost. This is primarily the normal cost of registering a larger population for voting. Supporters, the argument for the supporters is that voting is very important. It is an important right of all citizens. It shouldn't be taken away without a good reason, and being on parole is not a good reason. There also is voting is tying people into the community. That integrates parolees back within their community, and that type of integration can really reduce recidivism and keep people from going back in a bad direction. Now, on the opponent side, they're really arguing that the restrictions on voting are part of the punishment. So prison plus parole is your full time of punishment, and that should not be reduced, or voting should not be restored until that punishment is complete. And I'm going to pause here for questions because this is a constitutional. Oh, this is a constitutional amendment. Are there any questions currently?
A question for you. Do our taxes cover the annual voter registration cost anyway?
Voter registration, so that's out of the general fund. So the short answer is yes. Voter registration is something the state normally covers, so it wouldn't require any specific legislation to do so.
And Elaine is asking, is it true that affirmative action is now in effect for federal employment, contracting, and perhaps education like military schools?
I don't believe colleges within California are able to use affirmative action. So I know for sure that is prohibited, but I don't know the specifics of federal legislation. I don't know, Heidi, if you know something more than I do.
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Yes, and David, if I could add, this is Sharon again. I believe that is true for federal in contracts anyway. There are very specific provisions that have to be used in California, but federal law trumps California law. Ooh, bad pun.
But from certainly from the standpoint of college, in the UC system, the state college, this would have Proposition 16 would have a significant impact.
And if we could just do another question or two here. Joyce is asking, was parolee voting restriction in the original Constitution or added later?
I don't know.
I don't know. That's a very good question.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for some of these kinds of questions, there are so many ins and outs. You can always go to the different websites to search for this information. I know on one ballot measure, I actually went, I just Googled my question and got an answer for one of these. So you might try that, Joyce.
Okay, any questions further on 17?
That's it. Oh, you know, we did have one question on Beth was asking on Prop 16 what the contributions mean, and maybe one of the two of you could just address what should a voter interpret as these contributions as?
I'll take that question. So I did respond, but the contributions mean that a group of people, whether it's legislation or it's private or a single person, has raised money to either support or oppose the measure. And that means getting it on the ballot, as well as any advertisements that they want to use for contribution with the contributions.
And generally, one of the things you would want to look at contributions is if there's contributions that are heavily lopsided. In other words, opponents or supporters far outspend the opposite, or if the contributions all come from a very small group of individuals, that might or might not have an impact on how you choose to vote on this proposition or any other proposition.
And this is Sharon again. So we have a kind of a flurry of questions, but I'm going to hold it to one more. Elaine is saying, just to confirm, 2/3 vote is needed for passage of Prop 16 and 17?
No.
Okay.
All the propositions require a simple majority, which is 50% plus one. The only ones this election that require a super majority are the 3 local measures because they involve a tax change.
Thank you.
All right. Proposition 18, this one's actually very straightforward. So currently within the California law, you have to be of 18 years of age at the point of the election to vote in that election. So if it's the general election, you have to be 18 to vote in the general election. If it's a primary, you have to be 18 to vote in the primary. However, there can be 8 months between the primary and the general election. So you can have a situation where someone is prohibited from voting in the primary, but is perfectly valid to vote in the general election. This proposition is changing that and saying if they can vote in the general election, then they can always vote in the primary. Furthermore, if they could run in the general election because of age, then they can run in the primary. Then as long as they are of age at the point of the general election, that's when age is determined on whether they're eligible to vote in the primary or run for office. So this has some additional costs, again, for voter registration related issues. And the supporters are arguing logically that the primary is part of the general election. They're tied at the hip, so if you having them vote in one but not the other is a little bit, is not logical. They also remind people that encouraging voting habits at a young age is very good, and it's a worthwhile social objective. And from the opponent's standpoint, they're really arguing that people under the age of 18 are really not a voter community that's really independent. They're really dependent on teachers, they're dependent on family members, because they lack the life experience as an adult, and therefore they should not be voting in the election. And this one's relatively small on contributions both sides. Questions on 18?
David, we do have a couple of questions. So Clarissa is asking, there's already pre-registration in California. So are the fiscal impacts of Prop 18 actually significant?
I cannot, this is the fiscal impacts they have within the proposition, so I can't second guess it.
Okay. Okay. And then Leslie is asking, what if a proposition is on the primary ballot? Could 17-year-olds vote in that case, or just in the actual primary race?
Oh, so if the specific voting thing only occurs in the primary. I am not sure. I suspect it means they will not be able to vote, because that is the decision-making event. But would have to research that. I can't say definitively.
Yeah, you guys have really good questions here.
You guys have really hard questions too. You're keeping on our toes. Okay. Other questions?
No, I think that's it. I just wanted to, so Jeff was asking, when are we going to hear about Props 14 and 15? So we're going kind of out of order in a more logical sequence, what we thought was more logical. We'll see if that actually works out, but we're going to deal with the bond propositions next.
So this slide shows, and we have one bond measure this year, the Stem Cell Research Institute bond. The way it is now, California Prop 71 was passed in 2004 to fund stem cell research in California after the federal government decided not to fund any stem cell research nationwide. A $3 billion bond was approved to cover expenses for research, medical studies, facilities, interns, and a governing board called CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. CIRM runs every aspect of dispensing grants to universities for stem cell research. As of June 2020, there were only $30 million in reserve from the original bond measure. What will this bond do? The proposition would allow the state to sell $5.5 billion in bonds to continue the CIRM's funding of stem cell and other medical research and training, such as stem cell therapy, the delivery of treatments to patients, build research facilities, and pay for administrative expenses. $1.5 billion would be restricted to further study the brain and central nervous system, including diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson, epilepsy, among others. The changes are intended to expand patient access to stem cell treatments. The fiscal impact: the state would need to repay $260 million a year for 30 years, which is less than 1% of the general fund, and be the source of payments. The general fund tax revenue was estimated to be $37.3 billion at the end of June 2020. After 30 years, the total paid would potentially be $7.8 billion. The state is also entitled to a 3% royalty of revenue from the new inventions that result from research of new medical treatments funded by CIRM. The amount of the state might receive is not clear. Next slide, please. Supporters say California funding has led to significant advances in treatments and cures for many diseases, including over 2,900 medical discoveries to help patients with cancer, diabetes, HIV/AIDS, and children with immune system deficiencies, among others. Prop 14 will contribute to the rebound of the economy, employing students as interns, scientists and doctors as leaders, and even construction workers to build new facilities. Prop 14 is supported by over 70 patient advocate organizations. It will increase patient access and affordable treatments and provide patients, their families, and caregivers with financial assistance. This bond is for true basic research. $6.6 million has been contributed to date. How it got here, the petition was funded by Robert Klein, who chairs CIRM and led Prop 71 in 2004. Opponents say previous funding has not yet yielded the promised results for treatments or economic benefits. There are no contributions to date. A yes vote authorizes funds to continue stem cell research in California. A no vote would stop the funding for stem cell research with the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. This is an initiative statute bond measure. Are there any questions?
Yes, Heidi, there are a couple. So Irene is asking, is it true that the federal government is now supporting this research? And this was originally intended to replace it. Do we still need the supplemental support?
As far as we've been able to find out, there is some federal government money that is being used to explore stem cell research. However, we have not been able to find the exact amount or who they're contributing to. So in California State, they took their own measure to have a bond, so it could be something that our institutions could do for the people, not just of California, but it's used throughout the nationwide.
Yeah, and Heidi, here's one more question. So Beth is asking the cons to Prop 14 say that funds were used poorly. How do we know if this is true?
Well, we don't. But what we also have learned is that this new bond will also encourage replacing some of the people that are on it, and then also creating another group that will be specifically doing funding measures. Because right now there's like 35 people supposedly that are on the board, and they're going to I guess hire 12 more, or at least that many, and then have this other board, this other group within the administration monitor the funds much better to make sure that they can track where everything's going. So that's what I learned actually looking at the votersedge.org. There's a plentiful amount of information on there. It's amazing.
And I'm sorry, we'll do just one more question here.
Yeah.
So how does this money get repaid?
Gets repaid? Well, it doesn't. It's a bond measure that we support in order to fund all kinds of research using stem cell. And the repayment, well, that's not true. The repayment is out of the general fund. And since we would, if this goes through, 5.5 billion would be given to CIRM. And then with all of the payments, there's 260, let me go back to that slide myself. I have the detail here, that they would have to pay 260 million a year for 30 years.
Yeah,
And that's what the total would be. 7.8 billion would be paid back to the state.
You
So-
know, Heidi, I just realized, I think I misstated the question. I think what Megan was asking on the bottom of this slide where you say there's a 3%
Oh.
royalty.
Yes,
Where
that
does that
goes to the
go?
state. That would go to the California state. That would go into the general fund. That
Great.
would,
Thank you so
yeah.
much.
So it would
Yeah.
go back to the state.
But it's not expected to pay off the bond measure by any means. It's more of a token amount in the grand scheme of things.
Thank you so much.
Okay, property tax, one of the fun ones of this election, and also one where there's a lot of people, a lot of money flowing into it, a lot of people talking about it. So we bundled both two of these 15 and 19 together because you have to understand property tax to understand these propositions. So let me walk you through how it works today. So currently, since Proposition 13, we pay property tax equal to 1% of our assessed value. Now in practice, it's slightly more than 1% because it pays for any local bond measures that might be doing so. You could have slightly more than 1%. Like I think Palo Alto might be 1.1% or something of that nature. But 1% is the state-right property tax rate. And that's assessed equally on all forms of property: commercial, residential, industrial, agricultural. And the way this works is the assessed value is equal to the purchase price at the time you buy the property. And from that point on, it increases it does not increase to match market, instead increases in the direction of market rate, but only to a maximum of 2% per year. So roughly every 30 plus years, the value of the property will double. But in reality, the average increase in market price within California is more like 9%, so which doubles more like every 8 years. So what happens over time is that the people who hold the property the longest pay the least property tax. So, and this was intentional when it was passed. And then if the property is sold, at that point, the new buyer has paid for the property and the assessed value then matches the new price. And this has been in operation for many years. What they're doing with Proposition 15 is they're splitting, they're treating property different depending on the type. So sometimes this is called a split roll. And so residential property, apartment buildings, agricultural lands, businesses with less than $3 million in California holdings, nothing's changing. So all those groups, no impact. However, if you're a commercial or industrial property owner, and maybe a farm, it's kind of unclear on the farm, the language is a little ambiguous, then what will happen is you're no longer, the rules of what your property assessed value are is going to change. So instead of being every year at 2%, they will do every 3 years. Your property is moved back to your assessed value equals market value. So what it means, if the price goes up, if the market goes up 8.9% per year, your assessed value will go up 8.9% per year. And again, this is for commercial, industrial land property. The fiscal impacts are 6.5 to 11.5 billion in additional revenue for the state. 60% of which will go to local governments. The remaining 40% will go to schools based on a per capita basis. Okay, for the supporters argument, so there's a couple different elements to this. So part of this is they're arguing that the state and local communities really do need this money, and they're very worthwhile causes, and this is the right place to spend that money. They're also arguing that that property tax based off market value is actually the normal rule. That's what most of the country does. Most states have operated on that practice forever. So we're just moving the commercial and industrial property to the national norm. They're also arguing that mostly this is affecting a handful of large property owners in a significant way because of that $3 million cap. So it's really 10% of property, business and commercial and business property owners will pay 92% of the tax. And the other argument, sort of going in reverse order, is that one of the consequences of Proposition 13 is whoever holds the property the longest has the lowest tax rate. effectively from property tax. And businesses don't sell their property very much. And especially in California, they've learned not to sell the property. So what it's had over time is it shifted the burden of tax, which used to be roughly 50-50, to being more towards the residential property owners are paying a larger and larger share over time because they simply move more often. So that's a supporter argument, and this is placed on by petition from multiple sources. There's pretty broad support right behind this one. So from the opponent's standpoint, their arguments are actually very straightforward and very simple. This is a very large tax increase in a tough economic time. So they don't really support it for that reason. Landlords, and this can be commercial landlords as well. This is primarily what they're talking. Commercial and industrial landlords will pass costs on to their renters, and then will pass it on to the people of California. And this tax will cost us a lot of jobs. As you know, every time you do a big tax increase, employers have a choice. They can move to some other state, or they cannot start their business in our state. So they're really arguing. They're not arguing against the merits of how they'd spend the money. They're arguing this is just too big of a tax increase. So questions on 15 before we get to 19, which is actually a different spin. Sharon, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So Prop 15, we do have a couple of questions. So one is, does this tax affect inherited property? I should caution that it's my understanding this tax applies to commercial and industrial properties.
Correct. So the Proposition 19 involves inherited property. So I think that's a question to say for 19. This one is commercial and industrial, so that would not be covered normally in inherited.
And then Elaine is asking, will the property tax increase hit mom and pop barbershops that own their own buildings?
So because of the limitation, they have to be the owner of the property has to have at least $3 million of property within California. If most small shops would probably not hit that threshold if they own the shop itself, but if the shopping mall owner owned it, then yes, they would. That shopping mall owners would have to pay the extra property tax, and presumably they pass it on to the renters. So it kind of depends on where they are.
And then David is asking, who are some of these supporters? So CTA is the California Teachers Association. CFT is the California Federation of Teachers. SEIU is a union organization as well. And then Nancy is asking, are there any protections in place for business owners who rent whose landlords may be affected by Prop 15?
There is, and that one of the things the proposition does, and this is a modest protection, is the initial impact, which will probably be the most dramatic, is phased in, and that phase-in schedule, they have 3-year window to do so, and the legislature has the ability to define what that phase-in window looks like. So it's not a protection in the sense of people shielding them from taxes overall, but it does provide some flexibility in how this tax is implemented so it's not such a dramatic impact right away.
And David, just to clarify, so Norma is asking, how are farms not agricultural lands?
So the proposition said, so agricultural land, let's see if I can do this. The proposition uses agricultural land in the text. Agricultural land by itself is not a term that has a specific meaning legally. So that's where the ambiguity came from. So it didn't say farms, it said agricultural land. So since agricultural land is not a specific meaning, that ambiguity means it's a little unclear how farms would be affected.
Yeah, and then we've got a couple more kind of technical questions. Judith is asking, does this include properties that use part of a property for business? I think I would caution, we are not experts on tax law, so if you want to give it a whirl.
So I can throw, so if you're, let's say, renting part of your house out and doing your own, you're going to be below the $3 million threshold, or 99% of the time. If you have, it's hard to see what else would be a partial commercial and residential operation. And then but anything that's sort of a mixed commercial is really the $3 million threshold that's going to trigger, I think.
And then
But yeah,
David, okay. And
this
then
can get
David,
technical.
one more time. So what is it this required to pass? Is it a
This is a simple
supermajority?
majority. And the reason it's a simple majority is it's not changing the tax rate. It's changing the timing of assessment. And because of the specifics of how the rules are, timing of assessment does not count as a tax increase, so it is a simple majority.
And I just wanted to clarify to Susan, who asked the question. So it's a simple majority, not a super majority.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Okay, 19 is probably even more confusing. Okay, so this one you need, so after Proposition 13 was passed, there were a number of other propositions that were passed that sort of amended and provided sort of special exceptions. And one of the exceptions that was passed is an ability for some people within California to sell their house and move to another house and carry their assessment over. In other words, they sold their house and was assessed at $200,000. They sold it for $600,000, and they purchased another house for $400,000. You know, they could carry over that assessment. In other words, their property tax would be unchanged. There were restrictions. There were a lot of restrictions on it. You had to be 55 or older, or disabled, or a victim in a disaster area. It only worked in some counties, and you had to move within that same county. There were a number of restrictions that occurred to this. There were also other propositions that allowed you to, if you to pass on your property to your heirs and have that assessment go to the heirs as well. So these exceptions existed out there, and they've existed out there for a number of years. So most of these rules have been in effect since the 80s and 90s. But the most recent one is in 2018, we had Proposition 5, which tried to change these rules around transfers, and that failed, but it's rejected by 60% of voters. So this is another proposition going into that same space. And what this is doing is it's trying to broaden and standardize that rule while also restricting some of the abuses of the rule that currently exists today. So it only applies to people who are 55 years or older or disabled. So it does not apply to disaster victims. And it lifts the cap. So today you can only do this once. Now you can do it 3 times. You can move anywhere in the state, not just within the same county. There's limits. You can't do it if the property's too expensive. If you're changing from one valuation to other, there's some adjustments. So if you go to a more expensive home, your assessment will sort of be stepped up by the difference. But the biggest change, or the one that creates the most controversy, is the new owners, it has to be their primary residence. Or excuse me, it has to be the primary residence to have that assessment inherited. In other words, and it has to go to your children or your grandchildren. So today, if a person died and they had rental property, they could pass it on to their grandchildren at the assessment value going across. With this proposition, they will no longer be able to do so. It has to be their primary residence. And the other major change with this is they said the funding is primarily going to fire protection. In fact, 75% of it is required to go to fire protection statewide. And then the fiscal impact is sort of tens to 100 millions in new property tax revenue and tens of millions related to home sales. Now, the new property tax revenue is from 2 sources. So one of which is the exclusion of inherited properties. So since you can only have that assessment transfer over on a primary residence, that's obviously going to raise the property tax values on other properties that are inherited. But the other portion of this, and they don't really break down which half is which or what's the percentages, is this is to encourage people to sell and move. So the idea is if you move, because once everybody moves, their residential home is reassessed to the newer price. That also raises property taxes. So that's this proposition. I know it's confusing, but I'm going to try. We'll see if we can walk our way through the pros and cons. So from the supporter standpoint, they really see it as it's really valuable to close that loophole on inherited, basically commercial or rental property. By restricting to just the primary residence, that really brings it back to the intention of protecting homeowners, not protecting businesses. It also raises a lot of very useful money for schools, and fire protection is obviously top of mind right now, given all the fires we've had around the state. And this was placed on the ballot as sort of a negotiation between the state legislature and several bills, some supported by the realtors organization, some supported by other groups, and this sort of represents a compromise measure. Now, from the opposition standpoint, they really see this as a tax increase by blocking up the inherited properties. That it's a sort of a backhanded estate tax. This has also been an area that's had a lot of initiatives with inheritance benefits specifically added in 1986 and 1996, and specifically these modifications, almost identical modifications, were rejected in 2018. So they argue this should be rejected again. So that's Proposition 19. So questions? I'm sure there's questions.
Oh yeah, there's a few questions here. So an attendee is saying the voter information guide, they read it to read that this proposition does apply to disaster victims.
It describes the current law as affecting disaster victims, but the new law, the disaster victims are not mentioned. So that's because I had that same confusion when going through. The new law specifically mentions 55 or disabled, but when they're talking with the current state, they do mention disabled disaster victims. So,
and again, with the caveat that we're not tax attorneys, Mary is asking, can anyone inherit, or is it limited to children and grandchildren?
children and grandchildren.
Okay. If a senior only has a primary residence, Sue is asking, does Prop 19 affect that property owner at all?
If they're alive, this gives them the option to sell that property and move to some other location and have their assessed value carry over. So in that sense, yes, they are absolutely affected. They get a benefit they otherwise would not have. If that property is inherited by their grandchildren or their children, then probably this doesn't affect them at all. Certainly they're not getting new rights in that area, so it wouldn't make things worse.
Okay, and then we do have a couple more. So Deborah is asking, did she read the previous slide correctly to say that 19 doesn't apply if the home value is over $1 million? If so, is that the case currently?
This one I'm a bit fuzzy on myself, so I'm not sure on this one.
So again, I think we'd recommend that people go, so you're going to have to keep doing some homework. These are complicated propositions. So feel free to go to Voters Edge or the League of Women Voters website. There are a number of other sites as well.
This one specifically, especially if has a lot of complexity, there's a lot of restrictions and rules and narrow. This is this area of the law has always been intended as a special exception that only some people can benefit from. So there's a lot of restrictions on how this applies, when it applies. So for example, not everyone who inherits a property gets the assessment transferred over. There's restrictions on who can do that. So it's and I cannot talk to them. This is something, if this actually thinks it'll apply to you anytime soon, you want to talk to someone who's actually a tax lawyer.
Yeah, and then Cheryl has another good question, which is, what does the 75% of new funding must go to fire protection? Is that 75% of what the state collects? Or the total amount, or would that include 75% of, property taxes also go to school districts, correct?
So this would have 75% of whatever's collected because of this change going to fire protection. So like almost every other proposition that has come in, and it bypasses the some percentage must go to schools. I believe the remaining 25%, I think, goes to the general fund.
Okay. Oh, you paused. You're gonna say something about that? If not, why don't we go ahead in the interest of time? It's already 10 to 3, so we've got a few more ballot propositions to go through.
Okay. Criminal justice is next.
Proposition 20. This slide shows changes to criminal penalties and parole. The way it is now, it is good for some history about parole in 2014. Prop 47 converted some theft crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. People charged with a felony have longer jail time. Another change for parole was in 2016 with Prop 57. It allows nonviolent prisoners to become parole eligible after serving their primary term. At this time, DNA samplings are collected from felons, sex offenders, arsonists, and stored in the Department of Justice database. What will this proposition do? Prop 20 would reclassify 47 misdemeanor crimes to either felonies or violent felonies, such as repeat shoplifting, household violence, and sexual violence. It would restrict parole for certain offenses currently considered to be nonviolent. Prisoners would have to wait an extra year to be evaluated for parole once they have been turned down. Currently, they wait 1 year. Prop 20 would make them wait 2 years. The fiscal impact. Precise costs are difficult to estimate, but because it would result in an increase in the prison population and change the way post-release supervision is handled, Prop 20 could increase state and local county costs into the tens of millions annually for court costs, correctional facilities, and law enforcement officers. Next slide, please. Supporters say Prop 20 would not increase the prison population. It would only ensure that people convicted of these crimes serve their full sentences. Prop 20 reclassifies certain crimes like assault with a deadly weapon, sex crimes, and child abuse as violent. Right now, there's 4.3 million contributed, and it got here by a petition funded by police unions and supermarkets. Opponents warn the initiative would perpetuate unjust policing and that disproportionately harm people of color and poor people. This is a backward step. The right reform is to promote rehabilitation, not locking minor offenders up. This contributions tally to 5.8 million. A yes vote means that you approve of the change this proposition would make, which would be on top of 2016. So that would, those particular parolee statutes would then be changed completely. A no vote means that you want to leave things as they are based on 2016's proposition. This is an initiative statute. It was put on the ballot over a year ago. Are there any questions?
We're running kind of late on to schedule. We might want to hold off on questions until the end.
Yeah, there aren't any questions on this one at this time. I did want to mention that the Religious Action Center did urge a no vote on Prop 20.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Okay, next slide, please. Proposition 25, a yes or no on getting rid of bail. The way it is, people arrested but not yet tried would remain in jail unless they post bail. Bail cash is often provided via a short-term and expensive loan from bail bond companies for a high fee, as long as the person that has been arrested has property that they can post. with the loan company. In 2018, the SB 10 law was passed to replace the cash bail system with a new system. It has not gone into effect yet because it was challenged by the American Bail Coalition. What will this prop do? Prop 25 would get rid of the bail system and allow the state's new law, SB 10, to go into effect. It would allow state judges 36 hours to decide if people charged with serious crimes should be released, a conditioned release, or a detainment based on public safety and flight risk. The fiscal impacts: pretrial changes that could add hundreds of millions annually to the state general fund. Prop 25 could decrease county jail costs, possibly in high tens of millions annually. Next slide, please. Supporters say some people who are not yet found guilty or not even charged may be stuck with large debts to pay off the bail or the loan fees if they were able to get a loan by owning property to use as collateral. The current bail system is unfair. If you cannot afford bail, you must stay in jail. It keeps poor defendants in jail and causes more imbalance in society at large. $8.4 million contributed by justice reform and labor organizations. Opponents say releasing people from jail will make our communities less safe. The state's new system could discriminate against people of color and people from low-income neighborhoods. $8.4 million has been contributed entirely by bail bond companies. Yes vote means that you approve of the change that this proposition would make, which is to stop the use of bail bonds. A no vote means that you want to leave things as they are by using bail bonds for all people held after being arrested. This is a referendum. Majority approval is required. Are there any questions?
Yeah, Heidi, there are a couple of questions, but in the interest of time, why don't we keep moving on to some of the other propositions?
Good. Can you remember which ones they are if they don't have Prop 25 listed on them? Because we're going to go into some more difficult things.
Okay. All right, Proposition 21. So this is one of those ones that history helps understand it. So in 1994, the Costa-Hawkins Rental Act was passed, which sharply limited rent control options within California. And most of those options are restricted to properties that are pretty old, that were either grandfathered in or were fairly, or have been, or just built a number of years in the past. And then in 2019, the Tenant Protection Act was passed, which limited, so currently under Costa-Hawkins, the standard rule is that the rent control is pretty limited to certain types of homes, and they're older, but regardless of whether rent control exists or doesn't exist, if the property is vacant, the landlord can raise the rates to market rate before re-renting out the facility. So that's Costa-Hawkins. Tenant Protection Act modified that and restricted the number of total rent increases in total to no more than 5% plus the inflation rate to expire in 2030. So this is a form of statewide rent control, or at least, but from the standpoint of limiting increases. However, Proposition 21 is going to do something a little bit different. So what Proposition 21 does is it opens up a number of categories of business of rental property to be subject to rent control in the future at the option of that local community. So if the property is over 15 years old and is or is not owned by a person who just has another property, they can let me try this again. If the property is more than 15 years old, or if it's owned by someone who has 2 properties or less, or excuse me, and it's owned by someone who has more than 2 properties, then it can be subject to rent control. So in other words, if you only have 1 rental property, you're not going to be subject to this change. If your property is less than 15 years old, you're not subject to this change. What the change allows in a general sense is rent control initiative laws can now be passed in local communities to control rent for those properties, or if there are existing laws on those communities that were invalidated by Coster-Hawkins, they would now be valid again and could apply. It also adds 2 additional things that are new. It adds a cap on the total amount of rent could be increased due to a vacancy. Today there is no cap. If this proposition passes, that cap will be no more than a 15% increase within a 3-year window when the property is vacant. There's a court standard that says landlords must earn a fair rate of return. This proposition will define what that standard actually means. The fiscal impact of this is probably some reduction in local tax revenue, but it's unclear exactly what that is. There's a lot of complex interactions between property tax and sales tax, so it's unclear what the net impact will be. Okay, from the supporter standpoint or the opponent standpoint, you fall on the boundary of whether you feel that rent control in total is a net good or is a net bad. So if you're in the standpoint of rent control as a net good, you're going to agree with the supporters, which are arguing that rents in many of our communities are very high and increase rapidly. People are putting a very large segment of the portion of their income into renting, and the populations that are best able to manage that process are the local communities who should have rent control as an option. However, on the opponent's side, they're really arguing that the high prices of California real estate are really a shortage of supply. So rent control just protects the people who already have it. It doesn't actually solve the problem. And in fact, rent control will discourage new construction and make the problem worse. So whether you agree with the supporters or the opponents depends kind of on your philosophy. Rent control was on the ballot in 2018 and was firmly rejected. And that's Proposition 21.
And David, if we could just very quickly clarify, property owners with 1 or 2 properties
are not subject to Proposition 21.
Great, thank you.
So nothing changes for those people.
Okay.
Hey, Prop 22. The way it is now, the state passed AB 5 in 2019 to update state law to change who can be classified as an independent contractor versus an employee. Employees get benefits. The 2019 law requires rideshare and delivery companies to hire drivers as employees instead of an independent contractor. The state attorney general and 3 cities are suing Uber and Lyft for refusing to follow the state's new law. An independent contractor can choose when, where, and how much to work. An employee has their schedule and work set by their employer. In the past few years, some exemptions have been added to exclude some professions like doctors, lawyers, real estate agents, and creative professionals. What will this proposition do? Prop 22 would require ride, share, and delivery companies to pay drivers 20% more than the local minimum wage for time spent driving while allowing them to be independent contractors, not employees. It would also require delivery companies with independent contractors to provide their drivers with benefits like minimum compensation. There's a host of other things that I can go over if anybody's interested, but for time I will continue on. Prop 22 would also limit cities and counties from putting new rules on rideshare and delivery companies, such as setting a higher minimum compensation. Fiscal impacts: there could be a minor increase in state income taxes paid by the rideshare and delivery companies and the company investors from higher earnings on profits. Next slide, please. Supporters say Uber and Lyft said a year ago that they might leave because the state has been pressuring them to institute the AB 5 law. Rideshare and delivery drivers want to work as independent contractors, not employees. Forcing companies to hire drivers as employees would get rid of hundreds of thousands of jobs. Classifying drivers as employees as required under AB 5 would lead to longer wait times, higher prices, and less access to rideshare work. To date, there's 185.1 million in contributions, primarily from the AP-based delivery services. This petition was funded by the AP-based delivery businesses. Opponents say Prop 22 would eliminate basic workplace protections and replace them with lower guaranteed earnings and healthcare subsidies to save costs for the company. A majority of AP-based drivers work 30 or more hours per week. Rideshare and delivery companies don't want to pay drivers basic benefits. At this point, there is 12.2 in contributions from labor organizations. A yes vote allow app-based drivers to be categorized as independent contractors. A no vote would make app-based drivers a company's employee with benefits. This has been the most expensive proposition on the ballot to date. Initiative statute needs to be the voting session, and we will continue, I guess, unless there are questions.
No, why don't you go ahead? We don't have any questions right now. People are being very, very sweet to help us get through all of this.
Awesome. All right, so Prop 23, the kidney dialysis clinics. The way it is now, with federal regulation as the basis of Medicare Medi-Cal certification, the Department of Public Health regulates chronic dialysis clinics. Private insurance companies pay more for treatment than Medicare and Medi-Cal. There are two private for-profit companies, DaVita and Fresenius Medical Care, who dominate the kidney dialysis clinics in California. A patient's personal doctor is only required to visit them once per month during treatment at a dialysis clinic. A certain infection information is transmitted to the federal CDC. What will this proposition do? It would require at least one licensed physician on site when treatments happen for about 80,000 Californians to date who receive dialysis from about 600 licensed clinics. The required doctor on site would be paid for by the chronic dialysis clinic. The CDC would request an exception for a physician with a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant if there is a valid shortage in the area. The exception approved by the California Department of Health would last for 1 year. Fiscal impacts. Healthcare costs for state and local governments would likely increase in the low tens of millions of dollars annually. Next slide, please. Supporters say Prop 23 would prevent discrimination and protect patients in rural communities. Clinics should always have a doctor available to help because dialysis is a dangerous procedure. There should be proper reporting and transparency of infection rates to encourage clinics to improve quality because the Department of Public Health receives complaints about health and safety conditions, while two for-profit companies make $3 billion a year. Strong protections should be provided to vulnerable patients when clinics close. To date, there is 6.2 in contributions from the Service Employees International Union, United Health Workers of the West Coast. And they also put together the petition to fund it. Opponents say Prop 23 may cause some dialysis clinics in the state to increase costs. Prop 8 in 2018 was a cap on treatment costs. Give you a little history. It lost 40 to 60% after being the third most expensive ballot in California history. At this time, there is $93.1 million in contributions from the two major dialysis companies. A yes vote would mean that chronic dialysis clinics would be required to have a doctor on site during all patient treatment hours. A no vote, chronic dialysis clinics would not be required to have a doctor on site. This is an initiative statute, majority approval required. Next slide, please.
All right, Proposition 24 has the dubious honor of being the most complicated proposition on the ballot this year, probably over the last many years. It is 50+ pages long. It references other laws that are so it in its text. So it is truly challenging to read this proposition and truly understand what it does. I'm going to do my best to give you sort of the 50,000 foot level. So in 2018, the state passed the California Consumer Privacy Act through the legislature. This was a negotiated bargain between a proposition that was going to go on the ballot at that point and the legislature, and a lot of people weighed in on this law before it was passed. But what it does is it provides a number of protections for private consumer information, but that medical information, genealogical, financial location, personal information, personally identifiable information, all that type of stuff. And it was passed in 2020, and it's passed in 2018, but was not put into didn't actually go into effect until 2020 to give people time to adjust their websites and things of that nature. What Proposition 24 is really a response to that law that was passed in 2018, and it fundamentally argues that the 2018 law did not go far enough, that there's a lot of things it's not addressing, and there's some things that it didn't address quite correctly. So it has 15 new protections. There's ability to correct the information you have out there. Right now, the 2018 law protects against selling information, but it does not protect against information sharing agreements between companies. The Proposition 24 will do that. The right to opt out of having your privacy information. It imposes stricter timelines, more penalties. It has a specific agency charter to monitor and adjudicate this area called, rather than relying on the Department of Justice. It also has an interesting provision that says that that fundamentally says the legislature can modify this law as needed so long as they don't make it less rigorous. So they can make it harder, they can clean up confusion, but they can't weaken the law. And in part that was because of the person behind this proposition felt that the 2018 Privacy Act was much weaker than it should have been because of lobbying by the tech interests. Now, one consequence of the Proposition 24, because it makes a number of changes and you need to give people time to adapt to those changes, it does delay the implementation of these changes by 3 years. Fiscal impact, $10 million a year for the new agency, plus a few $1 million in litigation and compensated by potential penalties that the state receives. All right, that by no means gave you a detailed understanding of every change that happens. But from a supporter standpoint, this law closes a number of major loopholes that really aren't covered in the CCPA law. It really tries its best to restrict personal data only to the places that are actually providing you services that need that personal data. And it protects Californians from powerful tech interests and the tech interests, they monetize our personal behavior and they benefit from that. And this was funded primarily by Alistair McTaggart, who was the person behind the original 2018 law as well. Now, from the opponent's standpoint, the opponent's arguments kind of fall into two almost contradictory camps. So one side of them is really arguing that this law is very burdensome. It delays the implementation for 3 years. It'll be very difficult for smaller companies to accommodate to that. It's just a much more burdensome obligation on our business community. The other side, the other part of what the opposition comes from is really arguing that this law does not go far enough. That it really should push everything into an opt-in rather than an opt-out point of view. It allows the option for people to be charged a premium if they truly want privacy. And it also, again, reiterates that's delaying things by 3 years. So that's kind of the opponent arguments. And the contributions kind of lean towards the supporter argument, but are relatively small on both sides.
Okay, before we move on to the local measures, can I circle back to Prop 22? So we've got a bunch of questions piling up, but I did want to clarify. So a couple of people have asked on Prop 22, the amendment would require 7/8 of both, an amendment to this proposition later. Would it require 7/8 of both houses? So once an initiative has been adopted, once the proposition is adopted.
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. I'd have to look that up.
Okay. It must be in the advertising or something because we've got a couple of people asking. Okay, we're running really late and we have a bunch of great questions. Maybe we could move quickly through the local measures, which people actually may be more familiar with, we hope.
Okay. So I'm doing Measure O to start. And the way it is now. For 19 years, Palo schools have benefited from locally controlled funding that cannot be taken away by the state or other school districts. The approximate 16 million in annual funding is used to keep great teachers in our classroom, preserve outstanding academic instruction, and support students. It also qualifies seniors and low-income residents who are eligible for an exemption. What will this prop do? It will increase the current parcel tax by $16 per parcel, which is planned to begin July 1st, 2021 for 6 more years. In addition, the parcel tax would increase 2% per year, which is based upon an inflation adjustment for 6 years. It will also require the district by law to institute additional accountability measures. Although specific projects are not identified, Measure O will protect academic excellence, high qualified teachers, add support staff to help at-risk students, maintain smaller class sizes, support school libraries, teachers' professional development, provide enhanced high school electives, and maintain teaching specialists. Parcel owners currently exempted from the district's expiring Measure A parcel tax would automatically be exempted from this measure without having to file a new application. The fiscal impacts. This measure will allow the Palo School District to continue receiving approximately $16 million to keep Palo's high educational standards funded for all students. Next slide, please. Supporters say Palo schools rely on local parcel tax funds to maintain its recognized statewide and nationally recognized quality educational programs for all students. The tax may not be used to administer administration salaries or benefits. Supporting quality schools is a wise investment that protects our quality of life and values. How did it get here? It was placed by the Palo Unified School District Board of Trustees. This is the time, opponents say, that the school board take a fresh look at their budget and come up with a new plan. California has record unemployment. Many are struggling to pay rent or mortgages. A yes vote means that you approve extending the funding at the current rate for 6 more years. A no vote means that you do not want to fund Palo Unified School District education. Needs 2/3 of a vote to pass. Next slide.
In Measure S is the Valley Water parcel tax. So currently there is a water tax per parcel, which is about $68 per parcel or $260 per acre. This goes to the Valley Water District, and it pays for river support, cleanup, flood control, a wide variety of water-related needs. This tax is currently on the books and will expire in 2028, and an oversight committee provides an audit every 5 years. So what Measure S really does is it says it's not a temporary need, this is a permanent need. We're going to have to take care of these water needs. They don't go away. If anything, they're getting worse. So we want to make this tax permanent. And it effectively becomes part of their normal operating revenues and will raise about $45 million a year. From the supporter arguments, they're arguing that this provides stable revenue for future planning and projects. Growing population plus climate change means that the stresses on the water network are growing over time. This need is very real, and a pay-as-you-go tax is the best way to fund that need, and was placed by the Valley Water Board. From the opponent's standpoint, they're arguing that a couple things. So the permanent voter so anything permanent denies voters the ability to permanently hold this water district accountable. They would prefer to have something that goes to the voters every so many years. They're also arguing that we have 8 years to go before the current tax expires. So why vote on this now? And they have some concerns about the oversight committee because its members are appointed by the very board that are supposed to be auditing. They're not truly independent. So they're raising a number of objections to this. This also requires 2/3 majority to pass.
And Heidi, why don't we go on to Measure RR?
Yeah, sorry, I need to unmute. So Measure RR, the Caltrain sales tax, is an independent, Caltrain is an independent agency for 3 Peninsula Counties transit agencies who are VTA, SamTrans, and SFMTA, also known as MUNI. Caltrain is called the Peninsula Corridor Joint Powers Board. They operate passenger rail service between San Francisco and Gilroy. They serve 32 stations along the 77-mile corridor, operating approximately 90 weekday trains, which include the express, limited, and local trains. It is an independent agency for the 3 Peninsula Counties transit agencies. What will this prop do? It'll impose a tax at the rate of 1/8 of 1% within the 3 counties. It will provide reliable funding to cover Caltrain's operating service, rail and train maintenance, and capital purposes. An independent citizens oversight committee will be established to verify compliance with the purpose of this tax and an annual audit. Expand Caltrain's peak hours service from 6 trains per hour per direction to 8 trains per direction, as well as expansion of the Gilroy service to a minimum of 5 morning and 5 afternoon trains. A fiscal impact: the sales tax would generate approximately $100 million per year. This was funded by the Caltrain system. Next slide. Supporters say Measure RR is needed to maintain the Bay Area's essential transportation network. Transportation studies indicate the Measure RR's improvements would put the equivalent of 2 lanes of traffic on Caltrain instead of our highways. It will fund Caltrain's modernization program called CalMod with new electric rails and new electric trains that will be cleaner and quieter. Preserve service for thousands of essential workers, nurses, first responders, teachers, and students. Opponents say during COVID, Caltrain has lost approximately 95% of its ridership. The San Francisco to Silicon Valley service was used primarily by high earners before COVID compared to other directions. More thought about other options is needed instead of imposing a sales tax at this time. A yes vote is to approve a sales tax of 1/8 of 1% within the 3 counties for 30 years. A no vote is not to approve the sales tax. This requires a 2/3 approval to pass Measure RR. I'm done.
Great. Thank you both so much. This is Sharon again. So just to circle back on that Prop 22 question about the 7/8, our trusty League of Women Voters volunteers are operating in the background and looked that one up and confirmed, yes, once Prop 22 is adopted, it would take a significant majority of both houses of the legislature to amend or change the law. So you can see how important your vote is on November 3rd or before. We have a lot of questions in the queue, but I think we'd better end this session, I would just encourage people to keep reading, keep talking to your neighbors, learning more about these propositions. On behalf of Heidi, David, and myself, I want to thank you all for taking the time to learn about these measures that you'll be voting on. And thank you again to Temple Beth Am for co-sponsoring this event. If you have more questions, we encourage you to check the League of Women Voters website at lwvpaloalto.org, the Voters Edge website, votersedge.org. You can also, you can check your voter registration again and your ballot status at sccvote.org. You can register and vote in person if you need to at vote centers from October 31st through November 3rd. So be sure to vote early, vote safe, and be heard by November 3rd. Thank you again for your time this afternoon.